It was a brisk Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, the kind of autumn day that felt sharp and unforgiving. The air had just enough bite to remind everyone that summer's reprieve was over, a harsh clarity settling over the city. Leaves tinged with fiery orange and decadent gold scattered across the slick sidewalks as the morning commute swelled, people hurrying through their daily routines with heads down. In a modest, slightly worn apartment on the city's west side, Daniel Morrison stood at the kitchen counter. A stack of neatly signed legal papers rested before him, the final documentation for his impending divorce. He wasn't focused on the documents, however. His gaze was locked on his reflection in the dark, polished surface of the microwave, meticulously adjusting his tie. Every movement was calculated, precise, performed as if the world, or at least his board of directors, was watching his preparation for victory. The kitchen smelled faintly of failure and burnt toast, the acrid remnants of an overcooked breakfast. A simple, familiar ritual that had once defined their marriage, but which he now viewed with utter indifference. As he smoothed down the rich burgundy silk of his tie, an accessory that cost significantly more than the entirety of his wife's humble wardrobe, his thoughts drifted to the expansive future he was about to carve out for himself. The future without Elena. Elena, he muttered to himself, the word laced with genuine frustration and a profound impatience. It's over. In the adjacent, slightly darker living space, Elena Carter, his wife of 5 years, stood by the stove. Her hands moved mechanically, flipping pancakes with practiced ease. She wore an old, faded blue cardigan over a simple white shirt. Her jeans were patched at the knees, not a statement of fashion, but a testament to necessity and her determined frugality. She had not yet fully absorbed the cold reality that Daniel had already checked out of their marriage, still unaware that the silent, suffocating tension between them had been festering, turning septic, for nearly a year. Daniel could feel a familiar wave of simmering anger bubbling up as he watched her. He hadn't even made it a full year into their marriage before growing thoroughly exhausted by her quiet, unassuming nature. He had worked relentlessly to climb the corporate ladder at Hartford & Associates, sacrificing his time, compromising his values, and strategically shedding old relationships that no longer served him. But Elena, with her meek smile and painfully unpretentious demeanor, had always felt more like a sentimental liability than a vital partner. He had everything now. A burgeoning, prestigious career, the promise of a fancy penthouse in the city, and the enforced respect of his colleagues. What did Elena contribute? A small, unremarkable job at a mid-tier law firm. No influential family, no powerful connections. She offered him nothing but her crushing silence, which had become a suffocating enclosure. Sign the papers, Elena, he stated, his voice unervingly cold, completely devoid of the warmth and affection it had once feigned. Her hands froze mid-flip. She didn't turn around, simply standing there, her shoulders slumped in a posture of profound resignation to the inevitable. The pancakes, now visibly charred around the edges, filled the air with a heavy, bitter scent that underscored the failure of their union. Sign the papers, and let's both move on, Daniel repeated, the edge of impatience hardening his tone. Elena's hand trembled slightly, the spatula hovering above the cast-iron pan as she struggled to force air into her lungs. She could feel the enormous, crushing weight of the moment, the pivot point of her life, but she couldn't bring herself to turn and face him. Not yet. The hurt was too raw, too deeply embedded, too fresh. The last 6 months of their marriage had been a slow, agonizing process of watching Daniel slip further away, transforming into someone she barely recognized, a ruthless, self-serving stranger. You've already checked out, haven't you? She finally spoke, her voice a fragile whisper, yet it cut through the silence of the room with surprising force. Daniel spun around, his face flushing crimson with a mix of frustration and indignation that she dared to state the obvious. There's nothing to discuss, Elena. I'm done. He grabbed his expensive leather briefcase, throwing one final, dismissive glance at the woman he had once, fleetingly, promised to love and cherish. You knew this marriage was a mistake from the start. The silence that followed was deafening, weighted by years of unsaid truths. Elena offered no response. She simply set the spatula down onto the cooling stovetop, her gaze fixed entirely on the ruined pancakes. "I'm done," Daniel repeated, as if the sheer volume of the words would somehow cement the reality for himself. He turned sharply on his heel and walked out of the kitchen, slamming the apartment door behind him with a final, violent resonance. Elena, her chest heavy with sorrow, remained frozen in place. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't allow herself to cry. She just stood staring at the empty space where her husband had been moments before, a void that had swallowed 5 years of her life. Flashback. The beginning, 3 years ago. Elena had first met Daniel Morrison at a quiet, understated company event, a private gathering with the partners and associates at Hartford & Associates. At the time, she was working as an administrative secretary, just another unremarkable face blending into the office background. Daniel was a junior associate, still struggling desperately to prove his worth in the brutally competitive, high-stakes legal environment. His ambition had been palpable, a raw, undeniable hunger that Elena found both admirable and, at times, profoundly overwhelming. In the early, tender days of their courtship, Daniel had seemed genuinely different. He was vulnerable, capable of kindness, and brimming with unjaded dreams. He confided in her about his struggles, his crushing student debt, his anxieties about finding a place in the unforgiving hierarchy, his worries about the future. And Elena had listened patiently, offering him unwavering, selfless support without a moment of hesitation. But somewhere along the relentless path of corporate advancement, the vulnerable man she had married had entirely vanished. In his place stood a man utterly consumed by ego, status, and the intoxicating rush of power. His innate insecurities hadn't disappeared. They had metastasized into outright arrogance. He no longer needed her quiet support. He demanded her unquestioning admiration and servitude. The man she had once loved had become an unnerving stranger, someone who now saw her as nothing more than a functional means to an increasingly luxurious end. Present day, the final decision. Back in the apartment, Elena remained frozen in place long after the resounding echo of Daniel's departure faded. She had anticipated this moment, knew it was inevitable, but the reality was still a jagged shard in her heart. As she gazed out the kitchen window, her eyes caught a fleeting glimpse of the city below, a sprawling metropolis that had once felt full of dazzling possibilities. Now it felt desolate and empty. She had given everything to this marriage. Her heart, her trust, her steadfast loyalty, but it had never been enough to satisfy Daniel's insatiable appetite for more. Her thoughts drifted to the bedrock of her childhood, to her father's uncompromising teachings. He had sternly warned her that people reveal their deepest, truest nature only when they genuinely believe there are no consequences for their actions. Her father had raised her to understand the intrinsic value of human dignity, to see people for who they truly were, stripping away the polished masks they wore in public. And Daniel had performed exactly as predicted, showing her his true, callous self the moment he convinced himself she had nothing left to offer him. Now it was her turn to reveal the truth, the carefully guarded secret she had kept locked away for 5 years. Flashback. Elena's secret. Elena's father, Thomas Carter, had been a quiet, almost spectral man, an enigma even to those closest to him. He was a man who controlled vast, invisible fortunes in silence, strategically acquiring mineral rights and rare earth deposits across the globe. His wealth was so profoundly hidden and dispersed that even the most elite and relentless financial analysts could not accurately calculate his true net worth. To most of the world, he was simply another anonymous billionaire, a ghostly name lurking in the deepest echelons of global business. But to Elena, he had been everything. Her mentor, her protector, her moral compass. She had grown up in a sprawling, isolated estate in Montana, a place far removed from the clamor and superficiality of the world. Her father had rigorously taught her to look beyond mere appearances, to understand the true value of people based solely on their ethical actions, not their social status or accumulated wealth. She had left Montana for Philadelphia with a meticulously crafted new identity, determined to live a life of simplicity and humility. She worked as a secretary, deliberately pretending to be just another face in the crowd. And when she met Daniel, she genuinely believed she had found someone who could see her for who she truly was, beneath the facade. Instead, Daniel had only seen her as someone he could easily manipulate and control. For 5 long years, Elena played the role of the beautiful, quiet wife, silently and methodically observing Daniel's slow, steady descent into utter arrogance. She had never revealed her true identity, never once hinted at the immense, global power her family silently controlled. But now, as Daniel signed the divorce papers with such careless abandon, Elena knew the moment had arrived. It was time for the universe to reveal the truth he had failed to seek. The courthouse was hushed and reverent as Elena sat in the worn wooden chair, her fingers neatly folded in her lap. The room smelled of old, dry wood and stale, circulating air. A somber place where people came to violently sever connections, where lives were dissected and futures irrevocably torn apart. Elena had been here before, but never under these circumstances. She was no longer the meek, wide-eyed woman who had walked into this building 5 years ago. She was no longer the quiet secretary who had allowed Daniel to dictate every aspect of their shared life. No, today she was something else entirely, something far more formidable. The afternoon sun strained to filter through the tall, dusty windows of the courtroom, casting long, dramatic shadows across the cold, hard stone floor. Daniel sat stiffly across from her, his expression a predictable mask of arrogant entitlement. His new lawyer, a sleek, middle-aged man named Marcus Webb, sat nervously beside him. Daniel's eyes kept darting toward Elena, and though he tried desperately to conceal it, there was a tiny, unsettling flicker of doubt beginning to catch fire in his gaze. The woman he had systematically treated like an afterthought, like a disposable footnote in his grand story, was suddenly the most terrifyingly important person in the room. Elena remained silent. She didn't need to speak. She was waiting for the perfect, calculated moment, and she knew with cold certainty that it was rapidly approaching. Flashback. Elena's preparation. It had taken years of careful, meticulous observation to arrive at this point. Years of cataloging Daniel's actions, watching his arrogance swell and grow, watching him slip further into the precise type of man she had always known he would become. She had realized from the earliest days of their marriage that she was never truly seen by him. She was merely a means to an end, a compliant partner who could help him ascend the corporate ladder, someone who would flawlessly play the role of the beautiful, manageable wife. But Elena had always been exponentially more than that. Her father had taught her early on to observe ruthlessly, to study people for who they truly were, not who they pretended to be. He had warned her, constantly, that the full truth about a person's character only emerges when they believe there will be absolutely no consequence for their ugliness. Daniel had shown her exactly who he was the instant he believed she was nobody of significance. But she was not nobody. Her father's profound teachings had always anchored her, even when Daniel had arrogantly dismissed them as sentimental fluff. Power, vast wealth, and public status meant nothing in the quiet, ethical world her father had painstakingly built. She had learned that the true measure of a person's character wasn't how they acted when everyone was watching them, but how they behaved when they thought no one important was looking. Present day, the moment of truth. Judge Richardson, a severe woman in her late 60s with the seasoned air of someone who had truly seen it all, cleared her throat, pulling Elena's attention back to the present conflict. The judge had a hard-earned, no-nonsense reputation, and today, Elena desperately needed that severity. She felt a familiar, nervous thrum of anxiety in her chest, but she pushed it down firmly. This was the moment. The precise moment where Daniel would finally, horrifically, see the truth he had so willfully ignored. Elena glanced over at Daniel, who was deep in an agitated whisper with his attorney, Marcus Webb. He hadn't yet looked directly at her, hadn't acknowledged her presence save for the brief, dismissive sidelong glances he had thrown her way upon entering the courtroom. He was too consumed planning his next strategic move, too utterly convinced of his own inherent superiority. But Elena knew better now. She knew exactly what was about to happen. The judge adjusted her severe glasses and flipped through the thick stack of documents in front of her. She looked up directly at Elena. "Mrs. Morrison, I have some rather unusual documentation that was filed with the court late last night. A notice regarding the estate of Thomas Carter, deceased." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She had anticipated this exact statement. Her father's death had been agonizing, but she had compartmentalized her grief, knowing she had a mission to complete. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Daniel. He had no idea. Elena's father, Thomas Carter, had been a man of unparalleled wealth and silent power, but he had operated entirely in the shadows, keeping his financial empire so scrupulously hidden that even the most seasoned financial experts couldn't calculate the full, staggering extent of it. Her eyes met Daniel's for the first time since the hearing began. His arrogance faltered, just for a split second. His expression became unreadable, but his lips parted slightly as he stared at her, consumed by confusion. "Mrs. Morrison," Judge Richardson continued, her voice gaining a slight, perceptible edge of gravity. "Is Thomas Carter your father?" Elena nodded slowly, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor." The room fell into an immediate, profound silence. The immense weight of her simple answer hung in the air, palpable and suffocating. The shock on Daniel's face was utterly priceless. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered and died, his mind frantically racing to process the identity he had just heard. He had never once asked about her family. Never once in their 5 years of marriage had he shown an ounce of genuine interest in where she truly came from. And now the catastrophic truth was rushing out. The judge pulled a leather-bound document from a folder. Elena recognized it instantly. It was her father's final will, the very document that would change everything, obliterating Daniel's reality. Flashback. The will. When Elena's father passed away, she had quietly flown out to the remote Montana estate to handle his complex affairs. The funeral had been small, fiercely private. Just her and the very few people her father had trusted implicitly. He had never wanted a grand, public ceremony for himself. But the will, that was a strategic document designed for maximum impact. Her father had ensured that everything was perfectly in place, that she would be taken care of beyond measure. But he had also made it clear that the inheritance came with profound responsibilities and specific conditions. He had bequeathed her everything. The vast global estates, the incalculable mineral rights, the offshore accounts, the interwoven investment network spread across the globe. But he had stipulated, crucially, that she could never use the family name professionally or socially while investigating her husband. Her father had warned her specifically about men like Daniel. Men who would take cruel advantage of kindness, who would exploit vulnerability, men who would only value you for what they could cynically gain from you. And so she had lived a life of deliberate silence, of profound humility. She had painstakingly concealed her true wealth, playing the role of the poor, perpetually overlooked wife. She had permitted Daniel to treat her as if she were insignificant, even though she knew, with absolute certainty, that she could have ended his burgeoning career with a single anonymous phone call. She had waited, watched, and quietly observed. And now the long game was over. It was time to act. Present day, the unraveling. The judge's voice sliced through Elena's intense thoughts. According to this document, Thomas Carter's estate, including his mineral rights, global investments, and properties, is currently valued at approximately $214 billion. Mrs. Morrison, you are named the sole beneficiary. Daniel's face turned an ashen gray, drained of all color. His eyes widened in horrified disbelief, the confident smirk he had been wearing just moments before completely vaporizing. "I need to request a recess," Marcus Webb stammered, scrambling to his feet, his hands shaking slightly. This is completely unprecedented." But Judge Richardson was immovable. "Sit down, Mr. Webb. The will was filed properly and authenticated. It is time to move forward." Daniel's eyes finally locked with Elena's, fully meeting them. And for the first time in years he truly saw her. Not the quiet, meek woman who had cooked his mediocre meals and neatly folded his expensive shirts, but the woman who had quietly controlled silent empires from the shadows, the woman who had been patiently waiting for this precise moment of total exposure. "And your prenuptial agreement," Judge Richardson continued, her voice resonating through the shocked room, "explicitly states that all assets, including this inheritance, are separate property. Mr. Morrison, your entitlement is strictly limited to what you personally brought into this marriage." Daniel's face twisted in desperate denial, and his lips trembled violently as he protested. "This can't be real. I never signed any." But Elena was already rising slowly from her seat, the air in the room thick with crushing tension. "You signed, Daniel. You signed without reading," she said, her voice calm but steel-hard and utterly unwavering. "You were too pathologically eager to get through the wedding, too blindly convinced that I had nothing worth protecting." The judge slammed her gavel down with finality. "This court grants a divorce as requested. All assets will be distributed strictly according to the prenuptial agreement." The courtroom had fallen into a stunned, heavy silence, a stillness hanging in the air as Daniel stood utterly frozen, the world around him shifting in ways his spoiled mind simply could not process. His fingers trembled slightly, the expensive pen he'd been using earlier now lying forgotten on the cold stone floor. The low hum of murmured voices from the gallery behind him faded into a distant roar as his mind raced in agonizing loops. He had been so sure of his victory. Divorce was supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be his freedom, his total escape from a marriage that had long since grown stale and inconvenient. And now everything was collapsing in front of him, and he couldn't grasp why. Elena Carter, his wife of 5 years, wasn't just another meek, quiet woman, a forgotten secretary he had once taken pity on. No, she was the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar invisible empire, and he had been utterly blind to it. He had spent years deliberately dismissing her, treating her like a subordinate, like a disposable afterthought in his relentless pursuit of corporate success. He had ignored every hint, every small, almost imperceptible clue that suggested Elena was substantially more than what she appeared to be. How had he missed this cataclysmic truth? The revelation was too much to digest all at once. The woman he had treated with such cruel disdain, the one he had habitually ridiculed for her quiet, modest demeanor, had been the daughter of one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the entire world. And now the terrible, absolute consequences of his arrogance were crashing down on him like a seismic tidal wave. Flashback. The first signs of change. Daniel hadn't always been this toxic. He hadn't always been arrogant, pathologically self-assured, and utterly blinded by ambition. Once, he had been profoundly insecure, buried under crippling student loans and suffocating debt, struggling desperately to make ends meet and keep his head above water. But that was before he had met Elena. She had been kind, infinitely patient, and uniquely attentive. She had noticed him when virtually no one else had bothered. Daniel had been just another unremarkable law school graduate, barely scraping by, working for a firm that hardly acknowledged his existence. Elena, at the time, was simply a secretary. Her smile had been genuine, warm, and entirely unassuming. They had begun their relationship slowly, nothing flashy or ostentatious. Just quiet coffee dates and long, meaningful conversations about their hopes for the future. It was simple, it was easy, and it felt intensely real. But when Daniel's career began its steep ascent, he started to change, slowly at first. A new custom suit here, a fancier dinner there. Soon he was buying things, intensely expensive, unnecessary things, and Elena, with her modest salary and quiet nature, began to feel like a heavy anchor dragging him down. She wasn't keeping up with his manufactured pace. And that is precisely when things began to fundamentally shift between them. The first time Daniel had cheated on Elena, it hadn't been a drunken accident. It had been a calculated decision, one that followed months of icy emotional distance and profound neglect. His entire focus had been hijacked by climbing the corporate ladder. He had simply stopped noticing her, stopped genuinely loving her. She had become invisible in his self-constructed world of success and inflated status. Present day, the quiet revenge. The will reading had sent undeniable shock waves throughout the courtroom. But for Elena, it was merely the beginning of the lesson. The true purpose of this moment had never been about the money itself. It wasn't about revenge in the petty, traditional sense. It was about power, moral and structural power. It was about forcing Daniel to see exactly who he had become, and exactly who he had miserably failed to see standing right beside him. Elena stood perfectly still, her face impassive, as Daniel fumbled desperately for the facts, his hired lawyer scrambling frantically to make sense of the financial apocalypse. The rest of the room was a loud buzz of whispers and excited chatter. But Elena remained completely untouched, her tranquility almost unnerving in the chaos. She had known this day would come, the day when she would finally reveal the full, unvarnished truth. Elena glanced briefly at the judge, whose stern expression had softened just slightly when the sheer implications of her inheritance were dramatically revealed. This was justice, swift and absolute. But it was also a profound, expensive lesson. A lesson Daniel had willfully refused to learn for 5 years. Flashback. Elena's quiet observation. Elena had always been intensely observant. Even when she chose to remain silent and play the role, she had carefully recorded every single moment of Daniel's creeping emotional abuse. Every time he belittled her achievements, every time he ignored her needs or wishes, she had diligently kept a meticulous journal, a surveillance method her father had taught her to maintain, an intricate, detailed record of the true, deteriorating nature of their marriage. She had recorded the exact date when Daniel stopped being physically affectionate. She had documented the specific moments when his cultivated indifference had begun to feel like outright cruelty. His emotional neglect had been a constant, creeping force in their marriage, and Elena had been nothing but patient, waiting for the full measure of his character to be revealed. Her father's lessons had always been crystal clear. Observe, document, and truly understand. Elena had initially never planned to expose Daniel's worst actions publicly. But when he crossed a final, unforgivable line, when he began to treat her as nothing more than a functional means to achieve his narcissistic ends, that is when she made the final, devastating decision. It wasn't merely about leaving him anymore. It was about forcing him to understand the precise, painful consequences of his total moral failure. She possessed the quiet power to utterly destroy him, professionally and socially, but she didn't. Not yet. She had waited, just as her father had taught her to. Present day, Daniel's realization. Back in the courtroom, Daniel's world was violently falling apart around his ears. He could feel the judgment of the gallery's eyes boring into him. He could feel their contempt as the judge continued to read from the terrifying will. His throat was bone dry, his palms sweating uncontrollably. He hadn't prepared for this scale of destruction. What was more surprising, however, was that Elena wasn't gloating. She wasn't standing there, reveling openly in his catastrophic downfall. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, completely unfazed by his mounting panic and horror. The complete, absolute indifference in her eyes made him feel smaller, more insignificant than he ever had before in his life. Daniel had arrogantly assumed that because he had acquired some money, because he had achieved a certain status, he was untouchable. And yet, Elena had proven him profoundly wrong. Waited until this moment to expose him. She hadn't acted out of panic or sudden fury, but rather with a cold, almost scientific calculation of timing. She had known all along, hadn't she? She had known about Rebecca's existence, about the clandestine apartment he had rented near the Navy Yard, about every penny of the offshore money he had meticulously hidden away. And throughout that time, months, perhaps even years, she had maintained a chilling, impenetrable silence, observing his spiraling descent with unnerving detachment. Now, facing the wreckage of his life, he finally understood the brutal reality. She had won, not by fighting, but by waiting. Flashback the night before. The night before the will was officially read and the full extent of Daniel's ruin became public knowledge. Elena had sat alone in the muted stillness of her apartment. She spent hours quietly contemplating the last 5 years of her life, turning over the details like painful, polished stones. She thought back to the initial, hopeful days of their marriage when she had genuinely believed in the possibility of profound change. She had held on to the naive hope that her unwavering love, her fidelity, and her quiet strength could somehow cauterize the deep, festering insecurities Daniel carried, the fear of failure that drove his cruelty. But she had been devastatingly wrong. She had offered him everything she possessed, her absolute trust, her unyielding loyalty, and an ocean of patience. Yet Daniel, in his fundamental narcissism, had never been capable of offering the same measure in return. Her father's words, a forgotten maxim of the old financial world, echoed in her mind. Power is not simply about wealth or status. It is fundamentally about control. Elena had held the absolute power to incinerate Daniel's career and reputation with a single, anonymous phone call years ago. But that wasn't enough. Instead, she had chosen the slow burn. She chose to grant him the illusion of freedom, the time needed to fully reveal his ugly, true self to the world, and to ensure his eventual self-destruction was entirely his own making. Present day, the final step. Elena stood with a composed stillness that sharply contrasted with the chaos she had unleashed as the judge concluded the solemn reading of the will. Daniel's complexion had shifted violently, draining from a sickly pale to a pulsing Venus crimson. The bitter, undeniable realization was settling into his gut like a stone. He had been utterly outplayed. But what truly stung, twisting the knife deep inside him, wasn't just the catastrophic loss of wealth, nor the final, formal dissolution of their hollow marriage. It was the devastating knowledge that Elena had seen him for the miserable fraud he truly was, and rather than intervening, she had calmly permitted him to dismantle his own life, brick by painstaking brick. She hadn't needed to publicly humiliate him. She hadn't needed to expose a single one of his wretched secrets. His own hubris, his own actions had performed the execution for her. As she deliberately turned to leave the silent courtroom, Elena's voice, soft yet unervingly resonant, finally pierced the heavy silence. "Daniel," she said softly, her voice carrying across the high-ceilinged room with crystalline clarity. "I want you to understand one thing very clearly. Every single day of our marriage, I held the absolute power to end your career, to erase your reputation with one swift phone call. I could have destroyed everything you meticulously built. But I didn't." Daniel's heart seized in his chest, skipping a terrifying beat. His eyes grew wide, filling with horrified disbelief. He hadn't possessed the faintest idea how far Elena's network, her familial influence, truly stretched. She hadn't just been a spouse. She had been a sentinel, systematically watching him, documenting his every misstep, waiting patiently for this exact moment. "I didn't make that call," Elena continued, her tone steady, devoid of emotion, "because I wanted to see exactly how far you would go. I wanted to see how much of your true, rotten character would be revealed when you genuinely believed there would be zero consequences." Elena's gaze locked onto Daniel's, and for the first time, stripped of his arrogance and self-delusion, he saw her clearly. Not his dismissed wife, but a masterful strategist. "And now, Daniel," she concluded, her words final, definitive, "you will learn precisely what it's like to live with the genuine consequences of your own actions." The air in Philadelphia was thick and heavy with the first oppressive hint of winter, the cold and unrelenting physical presence. A stark, accurate reflection of Daniel's own internal state. His life, which he had once imagined as so meticulously, robustly constructed, was now visibly crumbling piece by agonizing piece, as the deep, corrosive consequences of his long-held arrogance and profound neglect sank deeper into his reality each passing day. In the ensuing days following the public courtroom revelation, Daniel's world had violently shifted. His prestigious law firm, Hartford and Associates, once the unwavering bedrock of his professional identity and self-worth, had quickly transformed into his personal, inescapable hell. The whispers among his colleagues, once faint, quickly suppressed, had grown into loud, open speculation, and his painstakingly crafted reputation had plummeted to an absolute low. The once proud, ambitious attorney, who had been on the dizzying fast track to partnership, was now viewed by every associate and senior partner as nothing more than a pathetic cautionary tale. Flashback: the rise. Daniel's sharp, relentless ascent to perceived success had always been fueled, not by passion, but by a deep, gnawing fear. Fear of failure. Fear of being utterly nothing. Above all, a terrified fear of reverting to the kind of people he grew up with, those individuals who, in his smug assessment, never amounted to anything of significance. This desperate hunger for success had consumed him whole, pushing him to work harder, forcing him to sacrifice his integrity and relationships, and driving him to climb higher, regardless of the personal or moral cost. When he first started at Hartford, he had been a lowest-rung associate, suffocating under a mountain of debt, struggling desperately to pay the rent on an apartment significantly smaller and shabbier than the one he currently kept for his mistress. His clothes were cheap, his meals were miserable takeout, and every grueling day served as a brutal reminder of just how impossibly far he still had to climb. But then, the seismic shift occurred. He started winning cases, not small procedural filings but big, high-profile corporate litigation. His confidence swelled to unmanageable arrogance, and along with it, his bank account ballooned. The bespoke Seville Row suits, the high-end German sports car, the sprawling luxury apartment overlooking Rittenhouse Square, they materialized one after the other, not as mere purchases, but as tangible rewards for his self-proclaimed superiority. Yet, it wasn't just his professional success that changed him. It was the twisted way he began to perceive the entire world. He started to look down with open contempt on nearly everyone around him, a gaze that landed most harshly upon Elena. Elena, the woman who had genuinely loved him when he possessed absolutely nothing, when he was merely a hungry dreamer in a tiny, rented space, had gradually become completely invisible to him. She transformed into the person he could easily dismiss, the silent figure he believed he could mold into whatever superficial role suited his current elevated status. In his mind, distorted by professional intoxication, she simply wasn't enough. She wasn't aggressive enough, wasn't stylish enough, wasn't, crucially, worthy enough of the man he imagined he had become. Present day, the collapse. Daniel sat rigid at his sprawling mahogany desk, the gleaming Rolex on his wrist, which was once a symbol of his achievement, now felt like a heavy, suffocating weight, a burden shackling him to a life that no longer existed. His once pristine corner office, filled with sleek modern furniture and aggressively expensive artwork, now felt overwhelmingly like an ornate prison cell. Every incoming call, every new email notification, every brief, judgmental glance from his remaining colleagues made him feel palpably smaller, weaker, more contemptible. "Mr. Morrison," a thin voice called hesitantly from the doorway. Daniel looked up sharply to see his assistant standing there, holding a painfully thin slip of legal paper. "What is it?" Daniel replied, his voice strained, tight with forced control. She hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "It's from the Pennsylvania Bar Association, sir. They suspended your license." Daniel's heart didn't just skip a beat. It plummeted, cold and heavy, into his stomach. Intellectually, he had known this ruling was coming. He had been preparing for it, dreading it, for days. But hearing the final, crushing words articulated aloud, hearing the full weight of his colossal failure compressed into such a simple, official sentence, was utterly annihilating. His entire career, the very edifice he had constructed from sheer ambition and endless hours, was dissolving, slipping away forever. "Is there anything I can do?" his assistant asked uselessly, her tone reflecting politeness more than genuine concern. Daniel knew there was nothing she, or anyone, could possibly offer. Nothing could fix this fundamental ruin. "No," Daniel replied, his voice barely a raw whisper. "I'll handle it." As the assistant quietly retreated, Daniel remained rooted in the oppressive silence of his office. The bustling world outside the window continued to move on without him, indifferent to his fate. He couldn't shake the vivid memory of Elena, of every calculated word she had delivered in the courtroom. She had been so unervingly calm, so entirely assured in her conviction, as she delivered his execution notice. And he had been completely blind. He had contemptuously dismissed her, ridiculed her intelligence, and in that process of dismissal, He had systematically destroyed everything they had once shared. Flashback, the turning point. It had been perhaps 2 months before the divorce proceedings officially began when Daniel realized, with a blinding, painful flash, just how far he had irrevocably fallen. He was sitting late one evening in his office, mindlessly staring at a complex financial report, when his private line rang. The voice on the other end was sickeningly familiar. Daniel, Rebecca Chun, his affair partner and the supposed future partner of his dreams, said, her voice cool, devoid of any past warmth. We need to talk. I found out something I think you should know immediately. He had been confused at first, but the shock came swift and physical when she relayed the staggering, unbelievable truth about Elena's inheritance. He couldn't believe her initially. How could he? Elena had always projected such an air of quiet, almost painfully ordinary simplicity. But as the truth began to meticulously unfold, piece by shattering piece, it completely broke his reality. Elena had been quietly concealing a massive generational fortune all along, a financial empire her father had built from the absolute ground up. Wealth that didn't just dwarf, but utterly invalidated everything Daniel had ever earned, everything he had ever chased. The very instant that realization struck him, his enormous, fragile ego shattered into irrecoverable dust. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had condescendingly belittled for years, was, in reality, one of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world. And he, the brilliant attorney, had contemptuously thrown it all away for cheap thrills and petty arrogance. The realization didn't hit him with the expected force of blinding, defensive anger. Instead, it struck him with an overwhelming, crushing wave of profound regret. The truth was out now, exposed to the light, and all that was left for him was the solitary, agonizing task of watching the pieces of his meticulously constructed life fall apart. Present day, the final blow. The next few days blurred into an indistinguishable, miserable haze. Emails and phone calls poured in, from former colleagues, from legal clients suddenly withdrawing their business, from old associates. People who had once looked up to him, envied his trajectory, now offered nothing but formulaic, polite condolences. Empty, meaningless words that could not fix the damage. Nothing could undo the catastrophic choices he had made. The firm terminated his contract, effective immediately. The notification had arrived via a brief, cold email from Human Resources, and the full weight of the announcement had crushed the last remnants of his spirit. His career, his reputation, his entire sense of professional identity, everything had been built around his work. Now it was utterly gone. And then came the hardest, most humiliating blow. Rebecca, his affair partner, the one he had deluded himself into believing would stand by him, had vanished. She had barely given him a second, calculating glance after the scandal broke and the extent of his financial ruin became clear. She was gone. Her family's prominent car dealership, the one he had so eagerly associated himself with, was facing insolvency rumors. Rebecca had executed a clean, efficient break, already moving on to someone with demonstrably more tangible power and higher potential. Everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, every betrayal he had enacted, had turned to dust. But what truly crushed him, what relentlessly haunted his waking hours, was the searing, persistent thought of Elena. She had been right all along. She had possessed the clear sight to see the truth about him, the inherent flaws in his character. She had known precisely who he was even before he had the courage to admit it to himself. Flashback, the realization. It was late one desolate evening when Daniel found himself staring blankly at the TV screen in his empty apartment. The local Philadelphia news was running a segment featuring Elena. She had been highlighted as the visionary behind a massive new philanthropic initiative, one specifically designed to provide robust financial literacy and comprehensive support to underprivileged families across the city. As he watched her composed figure, something deep inside him twisted violently with a mixture of pain and shame. He had dismissed her, continuously ignored her, and treated her as if she were insignificant, a placeholder. And now she was demonstrably, powerfully changing the world. The last thing he had ever truly expected was for Elena to find genuine happiness, to openly thrive, after their disastrous marriage ended. But there she was, large on the screen, smiling in a way he realized he had never once seen her smile during their entire time together. She had found profound peace. She had found tangible purpose. And he, the successful one, had lost everything essential. Present day, the wake of destruction. Daniel's life had been brutally reduced to a monotonous series of mundane, necessary tasks. Legal papers to sign, phone calls to return, unwelcome appointments to keep. He had learned to painstakingly put on the mask of normalcy in public. But beneath it, he was entirely hollow. He couldn't escape the consuming thought of what he had destroyed, how cruelly he had treated Elena, and the immense, irreversible price he was now paying for it. In the ensuing months, Daniel found himself compulsively questioning every single decision he had ever made, wondering at what exact point he had stopped seeing Elena for the person she truly was, the woman who had always been worthy of his deep respect, his genuine love, and his fervent admiration. But by that point it was definitively, tragically too late. The days stretched out before him like an endless, desolate sea of gray. The oppressive cold of Philadelphia was no longer a mere seasonal characteristic. It had settled deep inside Daniel's core, freezing him to the very bone. Every corner of his remaining life, from the cold leather of his luxury car to the echoing emptiness of the apartment he now called home, served as a relentless, physical reminder of the incredible height from which he had plummeted. The once thriving, ambitious future he had so confidently imagined for himself had completely evaporated. What remained? Nothing but a rapidly crumbling, ugly facade. The city outside continued its frenetic hustle and bustle, people rushing to and fro, intensely focused on living their lives. But Daniel was blind to it all. The cold, heavy weight of his terrible decisions had utterly consumed him. There was no escape hatch, no possible distraction, and certainly no immediate redemption. At least not yet. Flashback. The turning point. It had all begun with a seemingly small mistake. A single, fleeting moment of emotional weakness that Daniel had quickly convinced himself he could easily control, that it would ultimately hold no consequence. He had started meeting with Rebecca as he often did when Elena was conveniently out of town or busy. At first, their secret meetings had been charged with the illicit thrill of secrecy, the intoxicating excitement of something forbidden and dangerous. But over time, those fleeting emotions faded, replaced by something far more corrosive and destructive: pure arrogance. He had fatally forgotten the single most important lesson his astute, old-school father had ever taught him. Never underestimate the people who genuinely care about you, because they are the ones who will see your downfall approaching long before you ever do. Elena had always been that person, always present, always quietly supporting his endeavors. But he had ignored her, cruelly dismissed her, trading her loyalty for someone who could offer him a temporary taste of something new, something shallowly exciting. The night he had finally signed the divorce papers, Elena had stood before him, unwavering, impossibly calm, like a person who was privy to a secret he desperately needed but lacked. And she had been. Present day, the confrontation. It was a brutally rainy afternoon when Daniel received the unexpected message. It arrived in the form of an email from an unfamiliar, unknown account. The subject line was short and disturbingly precise. *, we need to talk. *, the body of the email itself was simple, written with the same detached, cool manner Daniel had recently grown accustomed to encountering in legal correspondence. But there was something about the simple text, a familiar shadow of authority, that instantly stirred a profound sense of cold dread in him. The email was from Elena. He stared at the screen for a paralyzing moment, fiercely debating whether he should even dare to open it, whether he possessed the strength to confront this final truth. But then, driven by a terrible compulsion, he clicked the message open. *, meet me at the old estate. I need you to understand everything before it's too late. The stark words struck him like a physical punch to the gut. *, the old estate. *, the place he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. The sprawling Carter family estate, deep within the green, rugged Pennsylvania countryside. The vast, somber mansion where Elena had grown up, where her hidden, staggering wealth had always been quietly shielded from the judgmental outside world. The place she had deliberately left behind when she married him, consciously choosing the deceptive simplicity of a life with him over the suffocating, immense opulence she had been born into. Daniel didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed his heavy coat, violently shoved his phone into his pocket, and blindly headed out the door. The rain was coming down in sheets, a true deluge, but he barely registered the weather as he drove through the empty streets, his mind reeling with confusion, anxiety, and a growing sense of panic. Why now? Why was Elena suddenly reaching out to him after the public spectacle? And, more importantly, what exactly did she mean by understand everything? Flashback: the Carter legacy. Daniel had only been to the Carter estate once. On the confusingly subdued day he and Elena had gotten married. He had smugly dismissed it then as just another part of her family's eccentric old-money charm, an overly large, slightly decaying country home. But now, driving through the cold, relentless downpour, he couldn't help but wonder with mounting terror how profoundly much he had overlooked. The mansion was gargantuan, imposing, yet eerily silent. No one had ever truly seen or known much about Elena's family beyond the surface. They were merely a powerful name, an omnipresent, financial enigma that controlled vast sectors of industry. What he hadn't known back then, what he had aggressively refused to acknowledge, was that Elena's wealth wasn't merely derived from her father's successful, visible business ventures. Thomas Carter had silently controlled more industries, manipulated more global markets, than Daniel could ever have imagined in his shallow ambition. Everything from cutting-edge tech startups to prime real estate holdings, from hidden mining operations to massive pharmaceutical patents, was now legally and exclusively in Elena's name. Her quiet, humble persona had been a painstakingly crafted veil, a flawless piece of performance art that kept her true, immense nature hidden from the world. But Daniel, blinded by his own self-importance, had never bothered to look deeper. Present day, the old estate. Daniel arrived at the looming estate just as the sky darkened further into a bruised, ominous purple. The mansion towered before him, its tall, ancient ivy-covered walls casting a heavy, suffocating shadow over the rain-soaked grounds. The massive front door stood slightly ajar, invitingly but menacingly, and Daniel paused, hesitating for a long moment, before pushing it inward. The huge house smelled of old, dry wood and the faint, unsettling scent of cold incense, as though it hadn't been genuinely lived in for decades. He stepped inside, and the silence was instantly, palpably suffocating. The vast hallways stretched out endlessly in front of him, lined floor to ceiling with large, oil-painted portraits of the Carter family. A long, stern lineage of immense power, hidden wealth, and unquestioned influence. He felt immediately small, insignificant, and acutely judged under their watchful, painted eyes. "Elena!" he called out tentatively, his voice sounding thin and small, echoing unervingly in the stillness. A soft, controlled voice answered from the floor above. "Up here." Daniel's heart began to pound heavily against his ribs. He knew this precise moment had been inevitable, the terrifying confrontation where everything would finally be laid bare, where the carefully constructed illusions of his life would come crashing down around his ears. He ascended the grand staircase, his heavy footsteps strangely muted on the polished wooden floors. When he reached the top landing, he saw her. Elena stood at the far end of the long hallway, her back toward him, gazing out a massive window that overlooked the rain-battered estate. She was visibly different now. No longer the easily dismissed woman he had married, no longer the subservient wife who had quietly borne his casual insults and neglect. The woman standing before him radiated an unmistakable aura of complete control, of formidable, unquestioned power. "You wanted to see me?" Daniel asked, his voice rough and strained. Elena turned slowly, deliberately, her expression utterly unreadable, her eyes like chips of blue ice. "It's time, Daniel. You need to understand who I am, who I have always been." Her quiet words struck him like a cold, heavy wave. She wasn't simply talking about monetary wealth. She was talking about power, the rare, foundational kind of power that truly shapes the world. the kind that had always been simmering just below the surface of their marriage, perfectly hidden from his sight. The exact same power he had so foolishly, so arrogantly dismissed. "I know you've never understood me," she stated, her voice low but piercingly steady. "You've always been too completely focused on yourself, too consumed by your ambition, to ever see who I truly am. I let you think you were the one in control, believing your own lies. But now you will finally understand the true consequences of that belief." Daniel swallowed hard, desperately trying to lubricate his suddenly dry throat. The corrosive arrogance that had once defined him began to rapidly fade and crack as he absorbed the crushing reality of the situation. Elena was not merely an heiress. She was a force of nature, a woman who had been meticulously controlling their entire game from the cold shadows, utilizing her strategic silence as her most potent weapon. Elena took a decisive step closer to him, her intense eyes locking immovably onto his. "I am giving you one last chance, Daniel," she said, her tone inflexible. "A chance to understand, perhaps to apologize, to finally look at what you've done without self-pity. But you are running out of time." Flashback. Elena's decision. In the crucial weeks just before the divorce proceedings commenced, Elena had made her final, devastating decision. She could have easily destroyed Daniel in an instant long ago, exposed him publicly for the systemic infidelities, the myriad lies, and the deliberate manipulation. She could have leveraged her staggering wealth, her hidden influence, and her family's global power, ending his legal career with a snap of her fingers. But she hadn't. Instead, she had let him bask in the false, warm glow of his temporary victory. She had allowed him to truly believe that he was the intelligent one, the one in control, the one winning the game. All the while, she knew with absolute certainty that she possessed the total, chilling ability to bring him down whenever she chose. That the purposeful, strategic ability to withhold the truth and the power was her true power. Not the money, not the status, but the control over the timing of the reveal. And now, standing directly in front of him, Elena saw the indisputable truth. Daniel had never been worthy of her intelligence or her loyalty. He had never grasped the depth of her character, nor the formidable inner strength she possessed. But now he would learn. Now he would finally see the real Elena, the woman who had always been infinitely more than just a quiet, convenient wife. She was a force that Daniel had never once respected, never truly appreciated. And the time had come for him to face the full, unmitigated consequences of that disrespect. Present day, the final lesson. Daniel stood there, utterly helpless, as Elena's devastating words sank deep into his soul. There was no remaining room for denial, no possible excuse left to be fabricated. She had given him every opportunity over the years to understand her, to see her complex, worthy self. But he had wastefully squandered each one. "Elena, Daniel began, his voice cracking painfully with genuine, desperate regret. "No," she interrupted, instantly cutting him off, her eyes cold and final. "You don't get to speak. Not anymore." Her gaze softened, momentarily, sadly, before she continued, her voice heavy with the weight of her suffering. "I gave you everything I had, my love, my complete loyalty, my entire life, and you treated me like I was absolutely nothing." Daniel could physically feel the crushing weight of her words, like 1,000 heavy bricks slamming down onto his chest. This was no longer about money or crude financial revenge. It was about fundamental, necessary justice. And Elena was finally, powerfully, taking what she had always deserved. Elena turned, walking slowly toward the vast window, her back to him once again. A final, deliberate dismissal. "I've learned one defining thing through all of this, Daniel. People only truly show their authentic selves when they genuinely think there are zero consequences for their actions. And you." She paused, her voice laced with chilling finality. "You are exactly who I thought you were all along." With that pronouncement, Elena turned her head one last time, her expression utterly empty. "Goodbye, Daniel." And just like that, he was completely alone in the vast, cold mansion, alone with the inescapable wreckage of everything he had feverishly built and then foolishly destroyed. The night air was heavy, thick with the unsaid, crushing weight of unspoken words. Daniel stood immobile in the middle of the immense Carter Estate's foyer, the entire world outside pressing against the massive glass windows, the relentless rainstorm lashing violently against the century-old mansion walls. His world had come apart, systematically, piece by agonizing piece, and now, in this eerie, profound silence, it was time for him to fully confront the self-inflicted consequences of his actions. He had walked into this house just hours ago, a man still full of ingrained pride, still relatively certain of his privileged place in the world, still clinging to the belief that his career, his perceived power, and his status could never truly be taken from him. But now, he was a mere shadow of the successful man he once was. His legal license had been permanently revoked. His career was destroyed. His professional reputation lay in tattered ruins. The firm had instantly severed all ties. Rebecca had walked out without a final word. Her swift departure yet another humiliating blow to his bruised, enormous ego. And the woman he had consistently mocked and cruelly belittled for years had not only outlasted him, but had comprehensively shattered the very foundation of his life's existence. He had been so profoundly sure that he had made it, that he was somehow above the consequences. But in the end, it was Elena who had engineered the last, devastating laugh. Elena who had maintained her powerful silence, expertly kept her vast power hidden, and waited with godlike patience for the perfect, calculated moment to expose the ugly central truth of Daniel Morrison. Now, standing alone in the grand foyer of the estate, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, was this all there was? Was this the final, terrible shape of his punishment? How had this disaster unfolded? How could he have been so catastrophically blind to the truth surrounding him? Every sign, every subtle tremor of warning, had been dismissed as irrelevant noise. He had been so consumed by his own reflection that he failed to see Elena for the formidable woman she truly was. The first shadows of doubt had appeared long ago, tiny fissures in their facade. These weren't grand revelations, but minor, daily inconsistencies, clues Daniel had willfully overlooked, filing them away as the quirks of an inconsequential spouse. Elena's composure, her almost unnerving quietude, was the silent rebuke to Daniel's spiraling, insufferable arrogance, yet he had simply written it off as meekness. Her family background was just another footnote in his ledger of associations, a vaguely rich but ultimately insignificant lineage. He thought of her as merely the daughter of Thomas Carter, a successful corporate lawyer, nothing exceptional, just another accessory in his elite social constellation. But Daniel failed to grasp the crucial detail. Elena was perpetually observant. She never competed for attention. She never craved the glare of the spotlight. This absence of need was the fundamental truth he couldn't process. She was wholly self-sufficient. Her father, Thomas Carter, was a legend built in the shadows. His empire was oceanic, its true depth of wealth and influence unknown even to the most seasoned insiders, and certainly unknown to Daniel, who prided himself on knowing everything. Elena had been raised in a world where profound wealth was a quiet inheritance, a responsibility, never a vulgar display. She had witnessed the heavy price Thomas paid for that power. The hardening of his character, the isolation, the eventual reclusiveness. Elena had internalized these lessons but refined them. She learned the art of measured patience, the power of observation, the necessity of the long game. When she married Daniel, it had been rooted in genuine, vulnerable love, a desperate hope to connect with someone who could look past the gilded cage and see the person beneath the secret, colossal fortune. Present day, the final, agonizing decision loomed. Elena stood motionless by the vast window, her slender form a sharp, dark silhouette against the turbulent sky. The mansion was utterly silent now, the relentless downpour outside a perfect, deafening counterpoint to the tempest raging within Daniel's skull. He had been anchored to the same damask armchair for what felt like an eternity, waiting for a divine spark, a sudden epiphany or intellectual breakthrough that would rationalize the collapse. But the moment of clarity refused to arrive. Only a dense, suffocating realization of his guilt remained. His memory now ruthlessly catalogued their years together. Every casual dismissal he had offered, every slight he had thoughtlessly inflicted, the times he had openly belittled her accomplishments. He saw the flicker of pain she had masked, the silent endurance of his cruelty, the chilling fact that she had possessed all the power necessary to retaliate, yet chose silence. Daniel struggled to his feet, his muscles atrophied from hours of immobility. His legs unsteady, he managed the short walk toward the window where Elena stood sentinel. "Elena," he started, his voice a frail echo in the huge room. She slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were arctic, yet they held a complex emotion he couldn't parse. Not fury, not gloating, but an infinite, paralyzing detachment. "You don't get to apologize now, Daniel," she stated, her voice unervingly measured and absolutely final. "You made your choices and I definitively made mine. This situation ceased being about us long ago. Now, it is solely about you confronting the wreckage of your own actions." Flashback. The moment of absolute clarity. The evening before the documents were formally signed, Elena had sat alone in the enormous master suite, gazing out at the sprawling, rain-slicked estate. It had required immense, punishing self-control not to initiate the confrontation months earlier. She had run the scenarios countless times, especially the moment Daniel had first treated her like an inconvenient servant. She had contemplated revealing the staggering scope of her father's hidden empire, the decades of influence and assets amassed in silence. But she always hesitated. Was this about righteous action or petty revenge? Was she truly ready to sever all ties and forfeit the comfort of their established life? The answer crystallized not in her own decision, but in Daniel's profound indifference on the night he signed the papers, dismissing her life and their marriage with a casual, bored flourish. The entire conflict, she suddenly understood, boiled down to control. It was Daniel's unwavering refusal to see her, to comprehend the quiet, foundational power she had always carried. And in that instant of icy realization, Elena knew this wasn't mere retaliation. It was the necessary act of finally releasing a man who had adored the fantasy of his wife, but never the reality of Elena herself. The final, crushing confrontation. Daniel watched Elena shift her focus back to the raging tempest outside. He struggled to recall the last time he had genuinely looked at her, the last time he had recognized the steel in her spine. This woman who was strong, fiercely independent, and utterly self-assured. "I am sorry, Elena," Daniel pleaded, the words splintering in his throat. "I should have treated you better. I should have." She raised a single, dismissive hand, a gesture that halted his torrent of belated remorse. "It is far too late for apologies, Daniel. Your window closed months ago. I afforded you more opportunities for redemption than any human deserved." His throat constricted. He took a desperate step closer, his eyes raking her profile, searching for any flicker of vulnerability, any microscopic sign of the old softness. There was none. She was granite now, an impenetrable fortress of resolve. "Do you still don't understand, do you?" she asked, her tone low and devastatingly calm. "This was never conceived as revenge. This was never about inflicting suffering upon you. This was fundamentally about me finally standing up for my own existence. I allowed you to systematically dismantle me for far, far too long." Daniel gasped, his chest seizing up. The very atmosphere seemed to thin, leaving him struggling for breath. He had spent years constructing elaborate justifications for his cruelty, weaving tapestries of self-deception. Now, faced with her truth, he possessed nothing. "You were given every path to redeem yourself, Daniel, but you consistently chose to dismiss me, to disregard every subtle message I tried to send. I maintained my silence. I permitted you to operate under the delusion that I was weak. But I have always known my own worth. And now," Elena's voice faltered barely perceptible, only to instantly regain its frightening strength. "Now you will finally see who I truly am." Her words descended upon him like a physical weight, crushing his ego, rendering him smaller and more insignificant than he had ever conceived possible. "Goodbye, Daniel," Elena murmured, finally turning her back on him, definitively. Flashback. The final communication. Hours later, in the deepening gloom of the deserted manor, a heavy vellum envelope arrived. It was secured with wax bearing an embossed crest, the formal seal of the Carter dynasty, a detail of her heritage Elena had meticulously concealed from him. His hands shaking uncontrollably, Daniel tore it open and read. It was a concise but devastating explanation of her resolution. She acknowledged the initial love she had felt for him, the honest foundation of their beginning. But she stated plainly that love alone could not sustain a relationship built on contempt. She outlined the scope of her inherited position, the fortune held in absolute secrecy for generations. Her calculated strategy, she wrote, was to step back and allow him the full latitude to act, to let his own inherent character be revealed, unimpeded by the influence of her status. The note concluded, sharp and simple. Asterisk, I hope that one day, you manage to grasp the full extent of the truth you willfully ignored. Present day, the aftermath. Daniel sat motionless, the thick parchment of the letter crushed to damp shreds in his hand. The trajectory of his self-destruction had never been clearer. He had lost absolutely everything. His public standing, his carefully constructed career, the woman he had carelessly discarded, and the very foundation of the life he had spent decades monumentalizing. He had lived under the delusion of invulnerability, believing his wealth and social power granted him immunity from consequence. He was spectacularly, disastrously wrong. He had spent years failing to understand Elena. But now, isolated in the echoing chill of the immense, empty mansion, the final, brutal realization dawned. Elena hadn't changed at all. He had. And ultimately, every miserable choice, every contemptuous word, had been a brick laid in the foundation of his own prison. Elena had moved on. She had seized control of her destiny and her fortune. Daniel was left stranded in the wreckage, clutching only the shards of his decimated pride. The torrential rain outside continued its relentless drumming, an external manifestation of the inescapable agony and turmoil tearing through his soul. But for Daniel, steeped in the overwhelming silence of his failures, regret was a useless, heavy burden arriving tragically too late.